Hello, I'm Robert Walker, voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is if you're scared of a world war or a nuclear war. And despite what all the clickbait news and mainstream media may make you think, we have actually gone past that era when there was any possibility of a world war or a nuclear war. That's in our past. It was when I was a child, during the Cold War, then there was a possibility, but only by a mistake. Even with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was never any possibility that the Soviet Union would try to attack the United States or NATO as a first strike. Everyone knew that if you fight a war, then you lose. You don't gain from a nuclear war, you only lose. And so there's never been that possibility of someone starting a nuclear war deliberately. The Cuban Missile Crisis was about a possible mistake that the Soviet submarine commanders might have made. And that's the same now, and when Putin makes his bluffs, he's just bluffing. He knows perfectly well that he can only lose if he uses nukes. And it's not because of mutually assured destruction. That never existed. There was never any idea that if you attacked with nukes that you would try and kill as many people as possible on the other side, which would be a major war crime. The reason that they kept escalating in numbers of nukes on both sides is because each one wanted to be sure that if it was attacked by the other side, it could respond and destroy the other side's nukes. And they needed lots of nukes, especially in the early days when they didn't have very good precise targeting, in order to have a chance of destroying a significant number of nukes on the other side. So they kept increasing numbers on both sides more and more, and never would ever be able to quite achieve their target of trying to destroy the other side's nukes. So that's all the Cold War increases of nukes were about. It wasn't about any that it would make you any safer to be able to kill more people on the other side, which makes no sense at all. So we've passed that era, thank goodness. We've had the nuclear reductions talks under Gorbachev, and then we have numerous precautions in place to make sure that we won't make mistakes, which is the only way that it could happen. And Russia at the moment is incredibly weak, and then the other thing is that there's no country that could actually fight a world war. So back at the time of World War I and World War II, there were two things. Countries could fight against even the world's superpowers and hope to gain rather than lose as a result of doing so. And then also the countries had the capability to fight globally as well. Well, now you can only fight and lose, not win, not gain. You can't gain if you fight a major war like that against a superpower. And the only countries that even have the ability to fight globally are United Kingdom, France and United States. All three of those have bases throughout the world, and seaports especially important, because that means you can get heavy things there by sea. So it really takes a long time. It's very hard to get material for any distance by plane. Now, Russia, it had one foreign port outside the former Soviet Union on the Mediterranean in Syria. It has lost this now because of the Syria uprising. So Russia has no capability of projecting force globally. And even in the entire Atlantic Mediterranean area, in the middle of winter, its ships can't even get there because the northern ports are frozen over. It's only a warm water port that doesn't get frozen over now are in the Black Sea, which is blocked off by the Strait of Bosporus during a crisis, and then if it's a belligerent in a war, and then there's the Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean. And Russia, Putin has never had any interest in trying to take over the world. His only interest has been to restore the former Russian Empire, which is roughly the size of the former Soviet Union. He's got no chance of that, but that's his only aim. Then when you go to China, it's not interested in force protection globally at all. Its only interest is in the South China Sea and Taiwan, and the reason it has warships anywhere else is just to protect shipping. It has a very small port in Djibouti alongside many other nations there as well, including nations from NATO. They all share the small African state of Djibouti on the Red Sea, and that's to protect shipping. And if China wanted to start a world war and try and take over large parts of the world militarily, it would have to build large numbers of military bases, and especially military seaports, and it's not doing that all over the world. It's not doing that. It's interested in economic and political influence globally. It's not interested in military influence globally. And it's got no chance of taking over Taiwan military either, but that's its only interest, and it's trying to do intimidation to try and get Taiwan to join China. If you look carefully, Taiwan is so protected. It's by the wide sea between it and China. It's a very advanced, far more advanced than Ukraine. It's got very advanced missiles. It's a similar level of economy to Japan and South Korea, and it's got the potential to call up over 1 million of its reservists, and it would have lots of notice of if China wanted to try and invade Taiwan, then it would take 6 months to recruit the 2 million people needed to invade Taiwan, and that would be very obvious. And then it would take 6 months to train them, and probably take 6 months to recruit them or longer, and that gives Taiwan plenty of time to do its recruitment and to train its reservists, which would be better trained than the Chinese ones if they're just raw recruits. So there's no way, and then we'd see these ships massing on the sea, on the Chinese shores, and there's no way it's even going to succeed. It's absolutely impossible. But when you look at the difficulties involved. But that's all that China's interested in. China already has the entire previous Chinese empire. The Chinese emperors were never interested in overseas colonies. Russia has only a tiny fraction. It's a very reduced version of the Soviet Union, and their objective is to regain the Soviet Union, which they have no chance of doing. Iran's only interest is in the Middle East, and it's much more limited than either of those two. It has only got, I think, 6 frigates, and it would take it a week to reach the UK. It's obviously not interested in a world war. And North Korea is only interested in South Korea. So there's nowhere in the world except the NATO countries that even could fight a world war. So if you go and look at NATO, then they are withdrawing from around the world. They want to reduce their overseas commitment because of cost reasons, especially the United States. It withdrew from Afghanistan. It's trying to withdraw from the Middle East. There's no way that the United States is going to want to try and fight a world war and take over anyone. And then if you worry about people being mad, then first of all, Putin he's not crazy. So when he invaded Ukraine, he did it because he thought it would be as easy. He'd had the previous experience of invaded Crimea, which happened really quite quickly in 2014 with almost no resistance. His spies told him that he could take over the whole of Ukraine even more easily in 10 days. And he didn't run this past the generals, only his top general, who's not very military astute. And so he literally believed that the whole thing would be over in 10 days and that there'd be almost no fighting. His spies told him that the Ukrainians were oppressed by Zelensky, and just a short Google search would have easily shown him that was false, but he believes the spies over Google and over Western media. And so he believed that the Ukrainians would be throwing flowers at the tanks and welcoming them into Kiev and helping them to overthrow the Zelensky regime, which he thought was an oppressive regime, rather than a freely elected, very popular president who had a overwhelming mandate and had a landslide victory. But Putin's used to rigging his elections. He just didn't believe it was a free and fair election. So that's why Putin invaded Ukraine, because he thought it would be easy, not because he was mad. And so he is not going to start a nuclear war, because no spy could ever convince him, and I'm sure they would never even try, and they certainly couldn't convince him that it would be completely safe to invade, to attack a NATO country. It would be the opposite. And NATO has a response force which will just go into place and just squash any attempt. They've got now 40,000, it'll be 300,000 after the war is over. So anyway, I go into that in some detail. I can go into that in some detail. But the whole point there is that Putin is not mad. He's not going to start a nuclear war. And then there are precautions to stop a mad president starting a nuclear war, or a mad general. There's a whole command line. He has to command a general who has to command other people. And it's the same thing in the United States. And so if Putin just woke up one day and he was completely mad, he said, go and nuke everywhere, and he doesn't have a little button he can press. He has to argue it out with his generals. And it's the same in the United States, that if and if Putin was just completely mad and he was saying, look, the giant spiders are attacking Russia, you've got to stop them with nukes, or something as crazy as that, then there's no way that his generals would obey that. They would find a way to prevaricate. And the usual way that this is handled in Russia is by a coup, where the others around him would actually kill Putin if he did something like that, even though he has very close allies amongst the spies especially. But they wouldn't obey a completely mad Putin who believes that Russia is being invaded by giant spiders or some such nonsense. It was the only way that he could really think it makes sense to use nukes. So that's not going to happen. And then it's the same with the United States, but it's much more. In the United States, they have the 14th Amendment. If Trump was to go mad, then Vance would remove him with the 14th Amendment. If it's something less serious, obviously gone mad, Alzheimer's, or just completely dotty. And then if it was something less serious, there's impeachment. And then if Trump was to, which certainly the moderates would not obey Trump if he clearly was gone crazy and Vance wasn't going to stop him. And then there's also the generals in the United States. So if Putin orders a general is actually legally required to obey, to refuse to follow an illegal order. Now it goes all the way down to the cadets. And so at all levels in the United States Army, they obey the Constitution first of all, and it's drilled into them right from the get-go. They must not obey an illegal order. They must refuse an illegal order. And US general, it's not a shrinking violet, is a way that sometimes put a very timid person. No, a US general is not, a four-star general is not a timid person who's going to just say, oh, should I say this, should I not? And he'll have his lawyers on the line with him. And if Trump was to insist and say, look, you've got to use the nuke, I've told you, then he'll say, let me just run this past our lawyers. There's nobody attacking us right now, there's no hurry. As long as they're not under imminent attack, then the general would say, let's run this past the lawyers. I've got the lawyers on the phone line, I always do, and let them talk to your lawyers. And then the lawyers would talk back and forth, and it would certainly end up in Congress, and Congress would not authorize. So that's what would happen in the United States in such a situation. So there's no way that either Trump or Putin is going to use a nuke. And we don't know so much about Kim Jong-un, but he will have precautions of some sort there as well. He won't literally press a button either. They've all seen all, all the ones that we know about have similar precautions in place because of the history of various times when it's got a bit close and there's been, and none of them want it to happen accidentally. And even Kim Jong-un wouldn't want it to be that on a bad day he accidentally presses a button and launches nukes. So you can be sure that he has some precaution as well. And Kim Jong-un has very few nukes anyway, and they all have it only for defense, not to attack. Nobody ever gets nukes to attack anyone, because if you use them, you've lost. The whole point in a nukes is never to use them. That's the basic idea behind them. So there are no countries that would ever use a nuke deliberately, and there's no countries that would, even if the world didn't have any nukes, there's no countries that would start a world war. The world is in bigger and bigger alliances now, military alliances like NATO. You've seen how NATO has grown as a result of Putin's aggression, and there's several alliances in the world. And if you go back since World War II, there have been no wars in NATO countries. Once they join NATO, then that's the end of wars for them. And then there are no internal wars, no attacks on their own territory. There have been no attacks on Mexico or up to Canada. That area hasn't been attacked at all. In fact, it's a long time since there's been an inter-country war in the entire Americas. There've been lots of internal conflict, but conflict between countries is much rarer. And then if you look at indeed in the world as a whole, it's actually quite rare for one country to challenge the borders of another country. It's much more common that it's internal conflict and minor conflict across the border, very minor conflicts. And Hans Blix, who's a weapons inspector and former director of the International Atomic Energy Association, and he would be the very person you'd think if would be talking about there being a risk into the indefinite future. He has the opposite view. He thinks that we are headed in the future. It's hard, even with the Ukraine war and everything, he sees these as minor incidents, just a blip. He says that we are headed towards a future without wars. He's written a book called Farewell to War. And arguably, we are not a civilized species yet, for as long as we have wars, as long as we settle disputes by killing each other. That's not civilized. And as we develop and become more civilized, and we are becoming more civilized, we're working together more and more, if you take the larger view, like the Paris Agreement, that is a very clear indication of a civilized approach to solving our global warming problems. Previously, there's the agreement to protect the ozone layer, and there's agreement to stop pesticides. There are many such ways in which we're coming together now are agreements to work together to stop and reverse biodiversity loss, and working together to eliminate hunger and make sure that everyone has access to free water, to fresh water for drinking and for sanitation, and access to health. We're aiming towards universal access to health for all throughout the world, and these are objectives through the United Nations, not through a global government. These are objectives by countries cooperating together, just as they do with the Paris Agreement, in a voluntary way, each making pledges and making bilateral agreements to help other countries, and sometimes multilateral agreements and so on. And in this way, and sometimes treaties, and in this way we're working together and we're solving our problems. And that is a civilized way to do it. And then we have competitions like the Olympic Games, like the Best Garden of the Year competition, Musician of the Year competition, and things like that. We have numerous competitions, so I'm sure we'll continue to have competition. We'll probably have Olympic Games on the moon and things like that in the future. But so it's not about ending competition. It is about trying to resolve difficulties by killing each other. That is not civilized. And so we are sure to come to an end of that in the future. I'm confident that in the future that our civilization will reach a point in which it's no longer doing that. And then, based on things like Hans Blick's farewell to wars, and then eventually scrap just not nukes. We might keep a few nukes just in case someone somewhere attempts to be another Hitler to stop them, but or we might have nukes for peaceful reasons. There are some peaceful uses of nukes, but far, far less than we have today, and very controlled to make sure they can't cause any harm. And so that is where we're headed for in the future. And also for nuclear propulsion, possibly in space. And maybe we move all our nukes to the moon. That is a possibility as well. And use them there in various ways. In any case, whatever we do, we're headed to a world with very few nukes or no nukes, and not just that, but scrapping missiles generally. We have far too many missiles. There's no point in them all. They're only there to protect against other missiles. And so many people who see a future where France, United Kingdom, United States, they won't need all these foreign bases. And so to end all those foreign bases, withdraw from the world militarily, to scrap all the missiles. But this, of course, can only be done gradually and by replacing them by other methods of preserving the borders that are protected under the UN Charter, and making sure that there is that there is an end to wars, just like there is within NATO already. Then eventually the entire world, not necessarily all part of the same military collaboration or anything like that, but that gradually, eventually, the entire world will be as safe as NATO has proven it can be today. So NATO countries do fight each other in foreign wars sometimes. Like for instance in Libya, France and Italy are on opposite sides of the war there, and Turkey. And so you do get even countries in NATO on opposite sides in foreign wars, but there's never, and then it's the Falklands War, with Argentina attacked the Falklands, which is not protected by the NATO treaty, even though it's part of the United Kingdom, because it's NATO only protects north of the tropics. So there's obviously quite a lot of work to be done before before the entire world is as safe as NATO is. NATO countries are internally, but that is the direction we're going. Larger and larger areas are protected by agreements such as NATO, which the countries within it agree not to fight each other, and then they agree to work together to protect the whole alliance against any attacks from outside. And this is gradually happening throughout the world. And then eventually through that we can reach a point where we no longer need all these missiles, and where there is an end to war, and the countries resolve their differences through other means, through negotiation, through dialogue, and then through healthy competition. So that's where we are headed in the long term. But in the near term, there's absolutely no possibility of a world war and no possibility of a nuclear war. And there's there's no possibility of even small wars like the Ukraine war happening inside NATO, and larger areas are safe even from smaller wars. So that is our situation. We are already past the time when we could even have a nuclear or world war. So why is it then we keep hearing it's clickbait journalism? Why do people believe that there is a possibility of a world war or a nuclear war? Well, that's just clickbait journalism and bluffs. And generals, they say things, some generals hint at the possibility of a world war, but if you look at their message, it's always saying, we need more money in order to protect NATO, to make sure that NATO is safe. They never say that NATO is at risk. They just say that NATO has to be safe, and that we need more money to be safe. And they have a perspective, they're always fighting for more money. But if you look at the most responsible, careful generals, and like example is retired General Petraeus, and Admiral Radakin, who's the current acting chief of the military in the United Kingdom, and General Petraeus is a very distinguished general who is constantly back and both of those are constantly back and forth. Petraeus is from the United States, and he was head of this CIA, I think, and he also led in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's always back and forth with, both of them are very up to date on Ukraine. He's always back and forth with Ukraine. And both of those say that there's no possibility of a world war or a nuclear war. And there's no possibility of Putin even thinking about attacking NATO. And it's just never going to happen. So we are very safe. That is what they say. So we are indeed very safe. And the governments, they often talk as if, including Zelensky. Zelensky gives the impression sometimes in his talks that NATO is at risk. But if you listen to him more carefully, he says that Ukraine has to join NATO because countries in NATO are safe. So he sometimes contradicts himself. He says, thank goodness, countries in NATO are safe, there is no war, people are not being killed in NATO, this is why Ukraine has to join NATO. So if you look at his central core message, it is that NATO is safe, that NATO is a safe place for countries to join, and that Russia did not attack the Baltic states because they were in NATO, even though they're much, much weaker than Ukraine. So Zelensky's central message is actually that NATO is the way that Ukraine can be safe. And so it is the way that we are safe already. That is his central message. He sometimes seems to be saying the opposite. But remember that he is constantly asking for help to defend Ukraine, very legitimately so. So that's why he says that. He sometimes is a bit vague about that and suggests that NATO is at risk. And then it's the same with other leaders in NATO and United Kingdom, United States, for instance. And they say, well, we need to strengthen our military to protect NATO, but then they don't really believe that NATO is at risk. That is absolutely obvious, because, as I said, when in the Cold War, when I was a child, then during the Cold War, we had a booklet that came round when all our doors telling us how to be safe if in fallout. Fallout is just heavy dust. It's just the mushroom clouds falling out of the sky. And so you've seen if there was a nuclear bomb just now, then first of all I'd see a big flash of light in whatever direction the nuclear bomb was. And when I do that, if that happens, I would cover my eyes immediately. I would look away, and then I would know that there's going to be a blast of air come this way. Would probably rush, any debris in front of me would be blown around all over the place. So I'd look for somewhere around here in a direction. It might probably just hide behind those trees in front of me, and so I'd look for somewhere around here to be protected from, and behind a wall or something, protected from any debris that is being blown in this way by the blast wave from the explosion. That would appear in about 30 up to 30 seconds or so from the blast. If I don't get the shock wave, then it's stopped, interrupted in some way. After about a minute, I know it's not going to happen, so I would then get up. So I'd get to the ground behind something heavy, cover my eyes and head with my arm, and head down to protect from any flying glass or branches of trees or whatever. And then, as soon as that was over, I would then rush to my house, which is just up